He was a man who was born into a world of racial segregation, a world where his very existence was a political statement, a world where his father was a Muslim and his mother was a white woman from Kansas, a world where he had to navigate the complex and often treacherous terrain of identity, a world where he was neither fully black nor fully white, neither fully American nor fully foreign. He was a man who was raised by his grandparents, a man who struggled to find his place in the world, a man who experimented with drugs and alcohol, a man who was searching for meaning, a man who was often lost. Now imagine that this same man, this confused and searching young man, would go on to become the first African-American president of the United States, a man who would inspire millions of people around the world with his message of hope and change, a man who would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, a man who would be a symbol of the progress that America had made and a reminder of the challenges that still lay ahead. This is the story of Barack Obama, a man who was not just a politician, but a symbol, a man whose life story is a reflection of the American dream, a man whose journey from poverty to the presidency is one of the most remarkable in human history. But here is what most people do not realize about Barack Obama, the man who is remembered as the embodiment of hope and change, the man who inspired a generation with his soaring rhetoric and his message of unity, was also a man who was deeply pragmatic, a man who was often criticized for being too cautious, a man who was a consensus builder in an age of division, a man who was not a revolutionary but a reformer, a man who was not a fighter but a negotiator, a man who was deeply human, and a man whose story is filled with contradictions that continue to fascinate and inspire us to this day. To understand Barack Obama, you have to go back to the beginning, to the sun-drenched shores of Honolulu, Hawaii, where he was born on August 4, 1961, into a world of beauty and complexity, a world that was a microcosm of the globalized world that was to come. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was a brilliant economist from Kenya, a man who had been awarded a scholarship to study in the United States, a man who was part of the first generation of African leaders who were educated in the West and who were destined to shape the future of their continent. His mother, Ann Dunham, was a young woman from Kansas, a woman of intelligence and idealism, a woman who was deeply committed to social justice and to the study of anthropology. They met at the University of Hawaii, a place that was at the crossroads of the Pacific, a place where different cultures and different worlds came together. They fell in love and they were married, but their marriage was not destined to last. Barack Sr. was a man who was ambitious, a man who was driven by a desire to make a difference in his country, and he was not willing to settle for a quiet life in Hawaii. He left his family to pursue his studies at Harvard, and he eventually returned to Kenya, leaving his young wife and his infant son behind. Obama was just 2 years old when his father left. He would see his father only once more, when he was 10 years old. A brief visit that would be a defining moment in his life. He was a boy who was abandoned by his father, a boy who was searching for a father figure, a boy who was trying to make sense of his own identity. He was raised by his mother and his maternal grandparents, Stanley and Madeline Dunham. His mother was a woman of immense strength and determination, a woman who was determined to provide her son with the best possible education, a woman who would eventually move to Indonesia to study anthropology and to help improve the lives of the poor. Obama was a boy who was constantly on the move, a boy who was exposed to a variety of cultures and experiences. He spent several years of his childhood in Indonesia, a country that was poor, chaotic, and deeply challenging. It was a world that was a far cry from the comfortable suburbs of Honolulu, a world where he was often the only American, often the only black child, often the only outsider. He was a boy who was learning to adapt, a boy who was learning to navigate the complexities of identity. He was a boy who was beginning to understand the world from a global perspective. He was also a boy who was deeply influenced by his mother's idealism. She taught him that the world was a place that could be changed, that it was the responsibility of each person to make a difference, that the most important thing was not the power you wielded, but the compassion you showed. She also taught him the importance of education, the importance of ejaculation, the importance of never accepting the world as it was. He was a boy who was being prepared for a life of leadership, a boy who was being shaped by the values of his mother. He returned to Hawaii to attend high school. A young man who was struggling to find his place in the world. He was a young man who was experimenting with drugs and alcohol. A young man who was searching for a purpose. A young man who was often lost. He was a young man who was deeply aware of his own contradictions. A young man who was not sure who he was or where he belonged. He graduated from high school and he enrolled at Occidental College in Los Angeles. It was a small, liberal arts college, a place where he was able to explore his intellectual passions and to develop his own political identity. He was a young man who was increasingly drawn to the cause of social justice, a young man who was inspired by the civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid movement. He transferred to Columbia University in New York City, a city that was a crucible of ambition and diversity, a city that would challenge him and shape him in ways that he could not have anticipated. He graduated from Columbia in 1983, and he moved to Chicago, a city that was a hub of political activism, a city that would become his home and the place where he would begin his political career. He worked as a community organizer, a job that was both demanding and rewarding. He was a man who was working with the poor, the marginalized, and the forgotten. A man who was learning the art of politics from the ground up. He was a man who was beginning to understand the power of community, the importance of organization, and the value of persistence. He was a man who was building a foundation for his future. He enrolled at Harvard Law School in 1988, a prestigious institution that would open doors for him and that would give him the credentials he needed to pursue a career in politics. He was a brilliant student, a man who was deeply engaged in the issues of the day, a man who was respected by his professors and his peers. He became the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review, a signal achievement that would catapult him to national prominence. It was a moment of triumph, a moment that demonstrated his extraordinary talent and his immense potential. He was a man who was now on the radar of the political establishment, a man who was being groomed for greater things. He graduated in 1991, and he returned to Chicago, where he joined a civil rights law firm and began to teach constitutional law at the University of Chicago. He was a man who was building a career, a man who was preparing for his future. He was also a man who was deeply influenced by his wife, Michelle Robinson, a woman of immense intelligence and ambition, a woman who would be his partner and his supporter for the rest of his life. They were married in 1992, and they would have 2 daughters, Malia and Sasha. In 1996, Obama was elected to the Illinois State Senate, a position that would give him the opportunity to learn the art of politics and to build a record of accomplishment. He was a man who was deeply committed to the principles of bipartisanship, a man who was not afraid to work with his opponents, a man who was able to build consensus on a variety of issues. He was a man who was building a reputation as a reformer, a man who was not afraid to challenge the status quo. He served in the state Senate for 8 years, and he worked to pass legislation on a range of issues, including ethics reform, healthcare, and criminal justice reform. He was a man who was building a record that would serve as the foundation for his future campaigns. In 2004, Obama was elected to the United States Senate, a position that would give him a national platform and a national audience. His keynote address at the Democratic National Convention that year was a moment of revelation. He was a man who was speaking with a voice that was both powerful and inspiring, a voice that was filled with hope and a sense of possibility. He spoke of the need for unity, for a politics that was not based on division, but on shared values and shared aspirations. He spoke of his own story, his own journey, a story that was both personal and universal. He was a man who was capturing the imagination of the American people, a man who was being recognized as a rising star. He was a man who was beginning to believe that he could make a difference. In 2008, Obama announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. It was a bold and audacious move. He was a man who was relatively young, a man who had only been in the Senate for a few years, a man who was challenging the political establishment. But he was also a man who was running on a message of hope and change, a message that resonated deeply with a nation that was weary of war and economic uncertainty. He ran a campaign that was both innovative and inspiring, a campaign that used social media and grassroots organizing to mobilize millions of people around the country. He was a man who was building a movement that was not just about him, but about a broader vision for the future of America. On November 4, 2008, he was elected the 44th President of the United States. He was 47 years old. It was a moment of historic significance, a moment that was celebrated around the world. He was the first African American to hold the office, a symbol of the progress that America had made, and a reminder of the challenges that still lay ahead. His election was a moment of immense pride, a moment that would inspire generations to come. His presidency was marked by both accomplishments and challenges. He signed the Affordable Care Act into law, a landmark piece of legislation that expanded healthcare coverage to millions of Americans. He ordered the military operation that killed Osama bin Laden, a moment of triumph in the war on terror. He negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, a controversial agreement that was designed to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. He also faced significant challenges. He was the president during the Great Recession, a period of economic turmoil that tested the nation's resilience. He struggled to build a consensus in a deeply divided political environment. He faced intense opposition from the Republican Party, a party that was determined to undo his legacy. He was a man who was often frustrated by the slow pace of change, a man who was not able to achieve all of his goals. He was a man who was deeply aware of the limitations of the presidency, a man who was forced to make difficult choices. He was a man who was often criticized by the left for being too moderate and by the right for being too liberal. He was a man who was caught in the crossfire of a political culture that was increasingly polarized and intolerant. After 2 terms in office, Obama left the White House in 2017. He has remained active in public life, writing his memoirs, supporting Democratic candidates, and working on a variety of charitable projects. He is a man who is looking forward to his future, a man who is determined to continue to make a difference. He is a man who is still searching for meaning, a man who is still trying to make sense of the world, a man who is still trying to live up to the ideals that have guided his life. The legacy of Barack Obama is one of the most profound in modern history. He is remembered as the first African-American president of the United States, a man who inspired a generation with his message of hope and change. He is celebrated as a leader who was both thoughtful and pragmatic, a man who was able to navigate the complexities of a divided political environment. He has been honored with a Nobel Peace Prize and a place in the pantheon of American heroes. He is a man who is admired by millions of people around the world, but his legacy is also a story of contradictions. He was a man who was a brilliant orator, but he was also a man who was often criticized for being too cautious. He was a man who was a reformer, but he was not a revolutionary. He was a man who was a symbol of progress, but he was also a man who was limited by the political realities of his time. He was a man who was not just a hero. He was a man who was deeply human, a man who was shaped by the contradictions of his own personality and his own time. Why should someone born today still care about Barack Obama? Because his life is a testament to the power of hope and the importance of perseverance. He was a man who was abandoned by his father, a man who struggled to find his identity, a man who was not supposed to succeed. But he refused to give up. He overcame every obstacle, and he achieved greatness. He showed us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He showed us that the pursuit of justice is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human will, and he was a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was also a man who taught us the importance of unity and the power of dialogue. He was a man who believed that the most important thing is not the divisions that separate us, but the values that unite us. He was a man who was not afraid to reach across the aisle, a man who was not afraid to listen to his opponents. He was a man who was not afraid to admit his mistakes, a man who was not afraid to change his mind. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the power we wield, but the wisdom we show. He was a man who taught us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a president. He was a man who was a symbol, a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who once said, Change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. He was a man who believed in the power of ordinary people to make a difference. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero. He was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero. He was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.